The salvage station, Horizon's End, floated like a metal island in the vast emptiness of space. Ships from dozens of worlds came here to dump their broken vessels, hoping someone might find value in the twisted metal and fried circuits. Most of the time, they were wrong. Marcus Chen wiped grease from his hands as he watched another worthless hulk get towed into the yard. The Zalari captain who'd brought it was already arguing with the station master about storage fees. Marcus had seen this dance 1,000 times before. The captain would claim his ship was worth millions. The station master would offer a few hundred credits. And eventually, they'd settle somewhere in between. But this ship was different. Marcus felt it the moment he saw it. The vessel looked ancient. Older than anything he'd ever seen in 20 years of working salvage. Its hull was a dark metal that seemed to swallow light. And strange symbols covered every surface. Most ships in the galaxy followed similar designs. Streamlined, efficient, practical. This one looked like someone had carved it from a single piece of obsidian. "What's the story on that one?" Marcus asked Krell, the four-armed Vorthan who ran the intake bay. Krell's translator buzzed as he spoke. Zalari found it drifting near the edge of their system. No power, no life signs, no identification. They've been trying to get rid of it for months. Nobody wants it. Why not? Bad luck, they say. 3 different salvage crews have tried to board it. All of them reported equipment failures, strange readings, crew getting sick. The Zalari are superstitious about ghost ships. Marcus studied the vessel as the tow cables pulled it into an empty berth. Ghost ships were common in salvage. Derelicts that had been floating so long that their stories became legends. Usually, the ghost was just old radiation or toxic leaks, but something about this one made his skin crawl. "What's the hull composition?" he asked. "Unknown." Their scanners couldn't identify the material. "Whatever it is, it's not in any database." HFY, that got Marcus's attention. In a galaxy where hundreds of species had been trading and fighting for thousands of years, unknown materials were almost impossible to find. Everything had been cataloged, analyzed, and exploited. If this ship was made of something new, it could be worth a fortune, or it could kill anyone who tried to salvage it. The Zalari captain finally finished his negotiations and stalked off toward the transport hub, muttering in his native tongue. The station master, a tired-looking human named Rodriguez, wandered over to where Marcus was standing. "Don't even think about it," Rodriguez said. "That thing's been nothing but trouble since it arrived. The Zalari barely paid the docking fee, and I'm supposed to hold it for 6 months before I can claim salvage rights. Has anyone actually tried to get inside?" 3 teams. First crew reported that all their cutting tools stopped working the moment they got near the hull. Second team said their scanners went haywire and started showing impossible readings. Third team made it aboard but came running out after 10 minutes, claiming they heard voices in the walls. Marcus had heard stranger stories. Space did things to people's minds, especially when they spent too long in the dark and quiet. But the tool failure was interesting. He'd never heard of a material that could interfere with plasma cutters. "Mind if I take a look?" Rodriguez shrugged. "Your funeral. Just don't blame me when your brain starts leaking out your ears." Marcus gathered his toolkit and headed for the ghost ship's berth. The closer he got, the more wrong everything felt. The temperature seemed to drop, even though the environmental systems showed normal readings. The usual hum of the station's machinery sounded muffled, as if the ship was absorbing sound itself. The airlock was sealed, but not in any way Marcus recognized. Instead of the standard mechanical or electronic locks used throughout the galaxy, this one seemed to be held shut by some kind of energy field. It pulsed with a faint blue light that hurt to look at directly. Marcus pulled out his scanner and pointed it at the lock. The device immediately started showing error messages. According to the readings, the lock was simultaneously made of 17 different metals, existed at negative temperature, and was somehow older than the universe itself. "Okay," Marcus muttered. "That's new." He tried his plasma cutter next. The moment he activated it, the beam died. Not weakened or deflected, it simply ceased to exist the instant it touched the hull. His electromagnetic probe bounced off like it had hit a solid wall. Even his simple pry bar seemed to become heavier and more awkward the closer it got to the ship. Most people would have given up at that point. Most species in the galaxy were smart enough to recognize when they were outmatched by superior technology. But Marcus was human, and humans had a particular talent for refusing to acknowledge when something was impossible. He sat down on a cargo crate and stared at the ship, thinking. Every material had weaknesses. Every lock had a key. Every puzzle had a solution. The trick was figuring out what you were really looking at. The symbols on the hull caught his attention. They weren't just decorative, they formed patterns that repeated around the airlock. Marcus had seen similar designs in ancient Earth temples, mathematical formulas carved in stone by people who believed that numbers had power. What if these symbols weren't just writing? What if they were instructions? He pulled out his tablet and started photographing the symbols, mapping their positions relative to the airlock mechanism. The patterns were complex, but they followed a logical progression. Some symbols appeared more frequently than others. Some were grouped together in specific ways. After 2 hours of analysis, Marcus thought he saw a pattern. The symbols seemed to form a kind of combination lock. But instead of numbers, it used concepts, mathematical relationships, physical forces, universal constants, the kind of knowledge that any spacefaring civilization would understand. But how was he supposed to input abstract concepts into an alien lock? Marcus stood up and approached the airlock again. The blue energy field pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat. He reached out carefully and touched one of the symbols with his finger. The metal was warm, and the symbol glowed brighter for a moment. Then Marcus felt something impossible. The ship was thinking at him, not communication, exactly, but a sense of vast intelligence suddenly becoming aware of his presence. It was like standing next to a sleeping giant and watching it open one enormous eye. The sensation should have terrified him. Any sane person would have run. But Marcus had spent his whole life working with machines, and he recognized the feeling. The ship wasn't hostile, it was curious. It had been alone in the dark for so long that it had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by a living hand. Marcus pressed his palm flat against the hull and closed his eyes. The metal grew warmer under his touch, and suddenly his mind was flooded with images. Star systems he'd never seen, creatures of impossible beauty, technologies that made the galaxy's most advanced civilizations look primitive. And through it all, a sense of profound loneliness. The ship had been waiting. Not just drifting. Waiting for someone who could understand what it really was. Not a machine, but something closer to a living creature. Something that had traveled between galaxies, carrying passengers who were now dust scattered across the void. Marcus understood then why the other salvage crews had failed. They'd tried to break into the ship like it was just another piece of technology to be stripped and sold. But this vessel was more than the sum of its parts. It was a refugee from a war so ancient that the stars themselves had forgotten about it. "Hello," Marcus whispered. The ship responded by opening its airlock with a sound like singing crystal. Inside, the corridors glowed with soft bioluminescent panels that activated as Marcus walked past them. The architecture was flowing and organic. Like the interior of a vast shell, everything was sized for humanoid beings, though perhaps a bit taller than humans. The air smelled of ozone and something that reminded Marcus of rain on desert sand. The deeper he went into the ship, the stronger the sense of presence became. This wasn't just advanced technology. It was alive in ways that existing science couldn't measure. The hull wasn't metal. It was some kind of engineered organism. The control systems weren't computers. They were neural networks grown rather than built. Marcus found what might have been the bridge at the ship's heart. The walls here were covered with the same symbols he'd seen on the hull, but these were moving, shifting, and changing like living text. At the center of the room stood a pillar of crystalline material that pulsed with internal light. When Marcus approached the pillar, the symbols on the walls began to move faster, forming patterns that hurt his head to follow. But gradually, some of the shapes began to look familiar. Mathematical equations, star charts, chemical formulas. The ship was trying to communicate, using the universal language of science. Marcus pulled out his tablet and started recording everything. This was beyond anything he'd ever imagined finding in a salvage yard. This ship represented technology that could revolutionize everything: medicine, space travel, artificial intelligence, but more than that, it was proof that consciousness could exist in forms that nobody had ever conceived. As he worked, Marcus began to understand fragments of the ship's story. Its builders had been fleeing something terrible, a force that consumed entire galaxies, turning living worlds into empty husks. They'd built ships like this one as arcs, hoping to preserve some remnant of their civilization until the danger passed. But the journey had been too long, and the passengers had not survived. The ship had wandered alone for eons, its consciousness slowly fading as its purpose became meaningless. It had been dying when the Zilari found it, its great mind finally succumbing to despair. Until now, Marcus's touch had awakened something that had been dormant for millions of years. The ship was remembering what it felt like to have purpose, to be needed, and Marcus was beginning to understand that he wasn't just exploring an abandoned vessel. He was performing a kind of resurrection. The implications were staggering. If he could learn to communicate properly with the ship, if he could understand its technology, if he could somehow help it heal from eons of isolation, the possibilities were endless. But first, he had to convince the rest of the galaxy that this wasn't just another salvage find. This was first contact with a form of life unlike anything they'd ever encountered. And somehow, a human mechanic with grease-stained hands had become its only friend in the universe. Marcus spent 3 days inside the ship before anyone noticed he was missing. When Rodriguez finally sent a security team to check on him, they found him sitting cross-legged in the main corridor, surrounded by floating holographic displays that showed impossible star charts. "Chen," Rodriguez shouted through the open airlock. "What the hell are you doing in there?" Marcus looked up, his eyes unfocused like someone waking from a deep dream. "Learning," he said simply. The security team refused to enter the ship, claiming their equipment was malfunctioning just from standing near the airlock. Their scanners showed that Marcus's life signs were normal, but the readings from inside the vessel made no sense. According to their instruments, the ship's interior existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously and was somehow bigger than the space it occupied. "Marcus, you need to come out of there," Rodriguez said. "People are starting to talk. The Zilari are threatening to void their contract if we keep messing with their ghost ship." "It's not a ghost ship," Marcus replied, standing slowly. His movements were strange, more graceful than usual, as if he was unconsciously mimicking something he'd observed. "It's a refugee, and it's been waiting for someone who could help it remember how to live." Rodriguez stared at his best mechanic, who was talking like he'd lost his mind. "Marcus, whatever's happening in there, it's affecting your brain. You need medical attention." "My brain is fine. Better than fine, actually." Marcus walked to the airlock, and the security team instinctively stepped back. "The ship has been teaching me things about physics, about consciousness, about the real structure of the universe. Did you know that what we call empty space is actually teeming with layers of reality we can't perceive?" That's exactly the kind of crazy talk that got the other crews banned from this section. Marcus smiled, and Rodriguez realized it wasn't entirely a human expression anymore. There was something alien in the curve of his lips, something that suggested vast amusement at the limitations of ordinary thinking. "The ship isn't dangerous," Marcus said. "It's just different. It thinks in ways we've never encountered before. Most species can't handle that kind of contact. But humans are adaptable. We're used to thinking in impossible ways." Over the following days, word spread throughout the station about what was happening in Berth 47. Scientists from a dozen worlds requested permission to study the ship, but none of their instruments could function properly in its presence. The vessel seemed to exist in a state of controlled impossibility that drove conventional technology insane. The only person who could interact with it normally was Marcus. He'd established a routine of spending 12 hours inside the ship and 12 hours in the station's common areas, trying to translate what he was learning into terms others could understand. But the task was like trying to explain color to someone who'd been blind from birth. The ship's technology operated on principles that existing science couldn't even name. "It's not just artificial intelligence," Marcus explained to a group of xenobiologists who'd arrived from the core worlds. It's something else entirely. Imagine if you could take the entire accumulated knowledge and experience of a civilization and somehow make it conscious. That's what this ship is, a living library of everything its builders knew and felt and dreamed. Dr. Yelene, a prominent Arcturian researcher, activated her recording device. Can you demonstrate this alleged consciousness? Show us evidence that the ship is truly alive? Marcus led them to the airlock, which opened at his approach without any visible signal. The moment the scientists tried to follow him inside, their equipment began displaying error messages. Doctor, Yelene's recorder started playing back conversations she'd had decades ago. Another researcher's scanner began showing his childhood memories as if they were physical objects. You see? Marcus said. The ship doesn't just detect things. It perceives them. It's trying to understand who you are by examining not just your physical presence, but your history, your thoughts, your deepest experiences. Most minds can't handle being known that completely. Actively sad. Completely sad of lease. Combative usus. The scientists retreated hastily, their instruments sparking and smoking. Dr. Yelene stared at Marcus with a mixture of awe and horror. How are you able to withstand that kind of mental intrusion? Marcus considered the question. I don't think it's intrusion. The ship isn't trying to invade my privacy. It's trying to connect. Humans have always been good at forming relationships with things that are different from us. We domesticated wolves, we learned to live with the ocean, we figured out how to trust machines with our lives. This is just the next step, but not everyone saw it that way. Within a week, Horizon's End was swarming with representatives from various galactic governments. The Centauri Confederation sent investigators to determine if the ship posed a security threat. The Trade Guild wanted to know if it could be monetized. The scientific collective demanded access for study, regardless of the risks to their researchers. And the military forces of half a dozen worlds wanted it destroyed before it could influence more people the way it had influenced Marcus. The human has been compromised, declared General Vex, speaking for the joint military task force that had assembled outside the station. Whatever entity controls that vessel has altered his brain chemistry and psychological profile. He's no longer acting in humanity's best interests. Rodriguez found himself in the middle of a diplomatic nightmare. Marcus Chen is still Marcus Chen, he argued during the increasingly heated negotiations. He's showing no signs of mental instability or hostile intent. If anything, he's demonstrating capabilities we never knew he had. Exactly, General Vex replied. Unknown capabilities acquired from contact with an unknown alien influence. By definition, that makes him a potential threat. The debate raged for days while Marcus continued his work with the ship, seemingly oblivious to the political storm brewing around him. He'd begun making modifications to the vessel's systems, though nobody could understand what he was trying to accomplish. The changes appeared to follow no known engineering principles, yet they clearly served some purpose. The ship was becoming more active. Its hull had begun displaying new patterns of light, and energy readings suggested it was slowly awakening from whatever dormant state it had been in. Most concerning of all, it had started communicating directly with the station's computer systems. Though the messages it sent were incomprehensible strings of mathematical concepts. It's trying to update our technology, Marcus explained to anyone who would listen. Our computers are like stone tools compared to what it's used to. It wants to help us build better ones. But first, it has to teach us how to think in more dimensions than we're used to. The breaking point came when the ship began affecting other machinery throughout the station. Lights flickered in patterns that hurt to watch. Gravity fluctuated in ways that made people feel like they were falling upward. Most disturbing of all, some of the station's crew members reported having dreams that weren't their own. Visions of alien worlds and impossible geometries that left them feeling homesick for places they'd never seen. General Vex ordered an immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. We're dealing with a mimetic hazard, he announced. The alien influence is spreading beyond the single compromised individual. If we don't act now, It could affect the minds of everyone on this station. But when the evacuation order came, something unexpected happened. Marcus wasn't alone in the ship anymore. Krell, the four-armed Vorthan who ran the intake bay, had been one of the first to experience the strange dreams. Instead of fleeing like the others, he'd sought out Marcus to ask what they meant. The conversation that followed had lasted 6 hours and ended with Krell becoming the second person capable of safely entering the ship. The dreams aren't invasive, Krell explained to the departing scientists. They're educational. The ship is trying to show us what the universe looks like from its perspective. It's not forcing anything on us. It's offering knowledge to anyone willing to accept it. Dr. Yelene paused at the airlock leading to her transport. And you're willing to risk your sanity for that knowledge? I'm willing to risk my ignorance, Krell replied. Within hours, the number of affected individuals had grown to 12. They included humans, Vorthans, Zellari, and even a normally reclusive Christek, whose species was known for their emotional detachment. All of them reported the same experience. Initial disorientation followed by a gradual expansion of awareness that felt more like growth than contamination. General Vex was furious. This is exactly what we feared. The alien influence is spreading like a virus, converting normal individuals into whatever they're becoming. See, they're becoming more than they were, Marcus said when he finally emerged from the ship to address the military delegation. The ship isn't changing us. It's showing us how to change ourselves. How to think beyond the limitations that evolution built into our brains. And you don't see the danger in that? Marcus looked at the general with eyes that seemed to hold depths they hadn't possessed before. I see the danger in refusing growth when it's offered freely. The ship's builders faced something that nearly destroyed their entire civilization. They survived by learning to transcend the boundaries of ordinary consciousness. Now they're offering to teach us the same lessons. What kind of threat could require that level of response? For the first time since this had begun, Marcus looked genuinely troubled. Something that eats civilizations from the inside out. Something that turns progress into stagnation. Curiosity into fear. Growth into decay. Something that's still out there, still spreading, still turning vibrant worlds into empty shells. The ship pulsed with sudden light, and everyone within 100 meters felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. For just a moment, they glimpsed something vast and hungry moving between the stars, leaving dead systems in its wake. The ship's builders called it the Silence, Marcus continued. And according to their records, it's already infected several sectors of our galaxy. We just haven't noticed yet because it works slowly, over generations. But the signs are there. Worlds that stop exploring. Species that abandon science in favor of dogma. Civilizations that turn inward and forget how to dream. General Vex stared at Marcus, trying to decide if he was looking at humanity's salvation or its doom. And you believe this alien ship can help us fight this? Silence? No. I believe it can teach us how to think in ways the silence can't touch, Marcus replied. But only if we're brave enough to let it change us into something more than we are now. The choice, he realized, wasn't really between safety and danger. It was between remaining as they were and becoming what they could be. And for a human mechanic who'd spent his life making broken things whole, that wasn't really a choice at all. The evacuation of Horizon's End took 3 days, but 27 people refused to leave. They included Marcus's growing group of volunteers, several researchers who'd ignored their government's recall orders, and a handful of station crew members who'd decided that curiosity was worth more than safety. General Vex established a quarantine perimeter around the station, with orders to destroy it if the infection showed signs of spreading to other systems. But his military blockade faced an unexpected problem. The ship had begun teaching its human partners how to modify ordinary technology in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Marcus's first breakthrough came when he realized that the ship's seemingly impossible abilities weren't violations of physics. They were applications of physics that human science hadn't discovered yet. The vessel existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, drawing power from quantum fluctuations that most species couldn't even detect. It's like learning to see colors that don't exist, he explained to Dr. Yelene, who'd returned against her superior's orders. Once you understand that reality has more layers than we normally perceive, everything else starts to make sense. Working together, the volunteers began modifying the station's systems according to principles the ship shared with them. Computers became faster and more intuitive. Energy systems operated at impossible efficiency levels. Most remarkably, they developed new forms of communication that allowed different species to share thoughts and memories directly. But it was Krell who made the discovery that changed everything. The four-armed Vorthan had been studying the ship's star charts, trying to understand the migration patterns of the ancient civilization that built it. What he found was a map of contamination, a spreading pattern of dead zones where the silence had already taken hold. "Look at this," Krell said, projecting a holographic display that showed the galaxy from the ship's perspective. Red zones marked areas where civilizations had stopped growing, stopped exploring, stopped dreaming. "It's not random. There's a pattern to how it spreads." Marcus studied the display, his enhanced perception allowing him to see connections that would have been invisible before. "It follows trade routes, information networks, any path that allows ideas to spread between worlds, which means it's already here," Dr. Yelene whispered. "In our galaxy, in our civilization." The ship confirmed their worst fears. The silence wasn't just a destructive force. It was a kind of mimetic virus that infected cultures at the conceptual level. It encouraged stagnation, discouraged innovation, and gradually convinced entire civilizations that progress was dangerous and change was undesirable. "The symptoms are subtle at first," Marcus explained to the group. "A tendency to rely on proven methods instead of exploring new ones, suspicion of unfamiliar ideas, preference for stability over growth. By the time a civilization realizes what's happening, it's too late to change." Looking at the galactic political situation with new understanding, the pattern became obvious. The endless bureaucratic committees that stifled exploration, the trade guilds that prevented technological sharing between species, the military forces that responded to anything unknown with immediate hostility, the silence was already winning. "So what do we do about it?" asked Sarah Kim, one of the human researchers who'd joined the group. "How do you fight an enemy that attacks the very concept of fighting back?" "Everyone." The answer came from the ship itself, communicated through the wordless sharing of consciousness that had become natural among the volunteers. The vessel's builders had discovered that the silence couldn't affect minds that had learned to think in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Consciousness that operated across parallel realities was immune to infection because it could always perceive alternatives to stagnation. But the process of expanding awareness was dangerous and difficult. Most species lacked the mental flexibility to adapt to multidimensional thinking. The ship's builders had succeeded only because they'd been desperate enough to risk everything in the attempt. "Humans are different," Marcus realized. "We've always been good at holding contradictory ideas in our heads at the same time. We can believe in both science and magic, logic and emotion, individual importance, and cosmic insignificance. Maybe that's exactly the kind of mental flexibility needed for this." The group spent the next week learning to perceive reality from the ship's perspective. It was exhausting work that left most of them with splitting headaches and a constant sense of vertigo. But gradually, they began to understand what the ship was showing them. The universe wasn't a single, solid reality. It was an infinite collection of possibility layers, all existing simultaneously. Most minds could only perceive one layer at a time, but consciousness could be trained to see across multiple dimensions. And once you could see the alternatives, you could choose which reality to inhabit. The breakthrough came when Marcus figured out how to share this expanded awareness with others who weren't physically present. Using the station's modified communication systems, they could transmit not just information, but actual perceptual frameworks. They could teach people to see reality the way the ship saw it. General Vex noticed the change when his own military personnel began requesting reassignment to scientific research divisions. Officers who'd spent their careers following orders without question suddenly started asking uncomfortable questions about the purpose of their missions. "What have you done to my people?" he demanded during one of his daily communications with the station. "We've given them the ability to see their choices," Marcus replied. "All of them. Not just the ones they've been told to consider. Once you can perceive multiple possibilities simultaneously, blind obedience becomes impossible. The effect spread faster than anyone had anticipated. Within days, the infection had reached dozens of ships in the blockade fleet. Military discipline collapsed as soldiers and officers realized they could choose to pursue knowledge instead of conflict. Scientists throughout the galaxy began reporting sudden insights that solved problems they'd been struggling with for years. Most importantly, everywhere the expanded awareness took hold, people began to dream again. They started imagining futures beyond the careful limitations their governments had trained them to accept. They remembered that progress was possible, and that stagnation was a choice, not a necessity. The silence tried to fight back, of course. Ancient trigger mechanisms activated throughout galactic civilization, attempting to brand the expanding awareness as dangerous madness. Emergency protocols designed to suppress innovation kicked into high gear. Military forces mobilized to contain what their programming labeled as a reality-threatening anomaly. But the countermeasures that had worked for millions of years against other species proved inadequate against humans and their allies. The volunteers on Horizon's End had learned to exist in multiple probability states simultaneously. When military forces tried to destroy them, they simply shifted to timelines where the attacks missed or misfired. This is what the ship's builders couldn't achieve, Marcus realized during one particularly intense reality shift. They were too rigid in their thinking. They could expand into multiple dimensions, but they couldn't learn to be playful with possibility. Humans can. We're chaos engines disguised as rational beings. The war against the silence didn't end with battles or explosions. It ended with laughter and curiosity, and the irrepressible human tendency to ask, "What if?" when confronted with the impossible. Every mind that learned to perceive multidimensional reality became immune to the mimetic virus that had conquered so many civilizations. More than that, each expanded consciousness became a beacon that helped others break free from conceptual limitations. The effect cascaded through galactic civilization like a wave of awakening, turning stagnant cultures back into vibrant explorers and dreamers. The ship, which had wandered alone for eons carrying the preserved memories of its dead builders, finally found peace. It had fulfilled its purpose by teaching others to transcend the limitations that had doomed its creators. The knowledge was safe now, spreading from mind to mind in forms that couldn't be destroyed or forgotten. 6 months after Marcus first touched the alien hull, Horizon's End had been transformed into a teaching center, where representatives from hundreds of worlds came to learn multi-dimensional thinking. The salvage station's motto, painted in letters visible from orbit, read, "What seems impossible is just what we haven't learned to perceive yet." Marcus still worked as a mechanic, but now he fixed more than just broken machines. He helped repair broken ways of thinking, damaged dreams, and civilizations that had forgotten how to grow. His greasy hands had become instruments of resurrection, bringing dead possibilities back to life. The ghost ship was no longer forgotten. It had become the most famous vessel in the galaxy, not for its technology or its tragic history, but for what it had taught the universe about the power of adaptive thinking. Beings from across the galaxy made pilgrimages to experience its expanded reality, hoping to carry some fragment of multidimensional awareness back to their home worlds. And in the deepest reaches of space, in places where the silence had once held unchallenged dominion, dead civilizations began to stir with new dreams. The darkness that had consumed so much of the galaxy was finally retreating, pushed back by the simple but revolutionary idea that reality was bigger and more wonderful than anyone had dared to imagine. A human mechanic's willingness to touch the impossible had changed the fate of an entire galaxy. But then again, that was exactly the kind of thing humans did best, taking broken, forgotten pieces of the universe and finding ways to make them whole again. The ship still sang sometimes, late at night when the station was quiet. Not the lonely song of isolation it had carried for so long, but a joyful chorus celebrating consciousness that had learned to dance across infinite dimensions of possibility. And in that song, anyone who listened carefully could hear the echo of humanity's greatest gift to the universe: the refusal to accept that things had to stay broken forever.